to Fresh Outlook. It is the first unofficial weekend of summer as we celebrate Memorial Day here in the States. I'm Toschi. So much to talk about this week. If you're a newbie to the show, here's what we do. We broadcast all over the world, so we usually start things off with a look at international news, followed by what's happening here in the U.S. And in our last half hour, we take a look at some of the other top topics that have people talking. Let's get to it. We're starting things off in Thailand. Now, Thailand hasn't been in the headlines lately, but this week it seized control of the front pages of the New York Times and many other major newspapers worldwide. And that's because after 6 months of political deadlock, protests, and deadly violence, Thailand's military seized power in a coup and scrapped the constitution. Here's more on that story.
2 days after declaring martial law in Thailand, Army Chief Prayut Chan-o-cha announces he is taking over officially. In a national broadcast, he explains his objective.
To reform the social structure economically, socially, and in other ways to create equality for everybody and for every side. The Peace-Maintaining Committee, which consists of the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, as well as the National Police, has to take control of power to administrate the country from 22nd of May 2014 onward.
Soldiers surround the meeting at Bangkok's Army Club shortly before the announcement. Earlier in the week, Chan-o-cha called rival factions to a meeting to end the protests and violence that have gripped the country. Shortly after Thursday's coup, the military has issued a national curfew banning people from leaving their homes between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m.
And as always, we welcome our distinguished guests, including my co-host, former White House aide Dee Dee Benkie, Dr. Alex Morescu from St. Peter's University, Don Mazella, veteran broadcaster, and Tom Squitieri, international journalist from our D.C. studios. And via Skype for the first time, we have Tim Webster, assistant professor of law at Case Western Reserve University. We welcome you all. Well, we are seeing quite something over in Thailand right now, and this is something we haven't seen for quite some time. Obviously, a friend of the United States and one of our allies. Dee Dee, you and I were talking about this earlier, that this is really a bad scenario right now.
Yeah, a huge ally of the United States. I mean, but we are forced to have problems with this and go to the UN and say we have to take away $3 million in aid and sanctions, and also push probably for $7 million because this is a full-fledged coup. This is very serious. They're rounding up people who are involved politically. They're going with social media, or they're getting rid of it, and they're nationalizing TV, and they're just across the board militarizing the country, which is not good at all. It's very, very serious.
And we want to talk about some of the things that the U.S. may or may not be able to do. Want to check in with Tim Sullivan also. You spent some time over in Thailand. You and I were talking about that as well. I've spent a lot of time in Phuket. Tell me what the situation is over there right now.
Sure. Well, according to local media in Bangkok, I'm in Cleveland, of course, there are small protests happening, gatherings of people in the 200 to 300 range. And of course, this is after, as you mentioned, the military did order a clampdown. Now, part of the military's actions were, as you've noted, clamping down on social media, clamping down on international and local media, but also saying groups of 5 or more people may not gather. That was part of the one of the orders that the new military coup or junta has put into place over the past 48 hours. Now, in defiance of that, you have seen, as I said, small-scale gatherings both in Chiang Mai in the north part of the country, as well as in Bangkok at shopping malls and other areas. So there has been some pushback, and if even though there is a media blackout, there have been pictures, there have been videos posted to various social media, and you can see the military looking there, sort of bored as people shout and say anti-coup, we're against the protests, we're against the military coup, and so forth. So the situation is, I think, stable despite obviously some very upsetting news about the most recent military coup in Thailand.
Tim Webster, thank you very much for explaining that to us. We also have Tom Squitieri. He's an international journalist. He's joining us in our D.C. studios right now. And Tom, thanks for joining us today on this Memorial Day weekend. Certainly as a journalist, when you see this clampdown on the press, it's very disturbing.
It is very disturbing. It's not unexpected, of course. And what I thought was interesting from a pure technical point of view was how they quickly blocked out certain internet sites, including BBC and other international news organizations, to prevent CNN, BBC, and others from going into the country. This is the modern-day 21st century equivalent of seizing the radio station right away on the first or second day of the coup to control the flow of information. So everything that the people of Thailand are seeing, almost everything that they're seeing, is being controlled by those now in charge, as well as the stuff coming into the country for the most part. Foreigners are still allowed to come in and out, including journalists, but there are on movement and the curfew, of course, limits the availability. I also thought from the yin and yang point of view of the media, they have these restrictions on the media, and they also have a very active and clever public relations operation. They had this photo distributed widely, for example, of some soldiers from some of the Thai soldiers walking across a street. The street, it had the markers for the pedestrian crossing, which was reminiscent of the Abbey Road photo of the Beatles. And it was joked about how all was missing was one of the soldiers didn't have bare feet. So they've been clever at manipulating a positive image that people like what has happened, whether they do or not, but that's what they're sending out.
Well, it's not just the media, but the tourism industry right now as well. Of course, they were always known as Teflon Thailand, but they've seen the number of visitors shrink by almost 40,000 people. It's really going to take a toll, almost like we saw this with Egypt. But this is going to be a tremendous impact on this country as well. Dr. Marescu, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would chime in on that Thailand, although it is a fairly stable economy and it's certainly positioning itself in the Southeast Asian market, there's some emerging markets in Bangladesh as well, and Burma, but it's an economy that's a fair amount of its GDP comes from tourism, and we've seen the Egyptian hard currency tourism virtually grind to a zero halt. And that will be a big concern. And I think that's part of the reason why that the Thai military is trying to keep this bloodless and trying to show a sense of stability.
And Don, just as a journalist, just to see these sanctions, if you want to call them, on journalists, just your thoughts on that.
Well, what's new? But that's, but I'd like to point out a couple of things. I've been involved with the Thai Army for a long time in a variety of ways. I'd like to point out three things. One, the Thai Army has overthrown the government 18 times.
And twice in the last 5 years.
Right, and always gone back to the barracks. That's a key point to keep in mind. Two, it is very tied to the American Armed Forces. By the way, 3.8 billion of what we send to Thailand is a drop in the bucket of what we really do. And third, it's a very efficient organization. This coup is one of the most efficient coups we've seen in a long time. So, I'd like to point out,
well, an efficient coup. Explain when you say, Dee Dee's shaking her head.
Yeah, I think that's oxymoronic because, you know, efficient is sort of a positive word. This coup is terrible. I mean, you know, they're taking away the rights of all these people, a curfew, and they're rounding people up if they have more than 4 or 5. I mean, this is bad. This is
yeah, but
comparatively,
it's not that bad.
Yeah, it is. How can you say comparatively? It's just bad overall.
But explain what you mean by an efficient coup.
Well, 3 things. And to answer your point, the military stepped in because the politicians were dysfunctional.
But that's what you say or what someone else says. It's still the government, though.
Which government? The one that was knocked out by the court, or the government that was replacing it?
Any government's better than martial law.
Well, that's a matter of opinion, especially when you know.
Egypt under Morsi is better than martial law?
Yes, are you kidding me? Martial law, I mean, that is not government. I mean, that's no sort of democracy at all. It's martial law.
But it's a democracy. Don't forget that the army is very loyal to the king.
Yeah.
And the king has helped bring a very stable economy, an economy that really, yes, it has problems with its elections, but still has elections. And the army is probably the most efficient part of the Thailand outside of its tourist industry.
And it consistently cedes power back to civilian elections.
And it will do it again.
Also certainly had a growing economy. But the question that we have now for Tom down in D.C., what can the U.S. do now?
Well, the U.S. and Thailand have a very strong relationship. You know, it bears mentioning that in the early part of President Bush, the last George W. Bush administration, that some of the secret camps that they would take people from Afghanistan and elsewhere, they were located in Thailand. That shows the depth of the relationship between the United States government in Thailand. The United States wants stability in Southeast Asia, and the coup, whether some people like it or not, is seen by some in Washington as a way to that stability. Now, the one good thing about coups in Thailand, if there is anything good about a coup, is that they have so many of them in Thailand. It's almost like a change of government that you would see in some other country.
That's right.
As earlier was mentioned, it's not really a democracy in the way we think of a term democracy, but then there are very few replicas of democracy beyond a few handful of nations around the world. The United States will seek to contain any abuses of power within the coup, such as on the media, such as the political opponents that went to that meeting earlier this week, a couple days before the coup. They want to make sure that human rights are protected, and they want to minimize the opposition that could grow within the United States that could put pressure on Congress or the White House to try to be more heavy-handed in resolving it. The bottom line is the United States, again, seeks stability because their influence in Thailand, while great, at this moment of the coup, it's the coup people who are in charge.
All right, thank you so much, Tom. We also want to check in with Tim Webster in Ohio and just get final thoughts from you as well.
Sure. I think it's important, as some of our speakers have already said, that Thailand has been a deeply fractured society for most of the past 10 years between, broadly speaking, the yellow shirts and the red shirts, the supporters of the regime that was in office until May of this year, and a broader kind of Bangkok elite who have been protesting that government for the past 7 months. So again, even though it sounds odd for us to see a military coup as something that might actually help preserve peace, we do have a precedent as late as 2006, which suggests that when the military steps in, they try to make peace, they try to figure out a way to redistribute power, and then they back off. So the last coup, we saw the Thai military in power for about 4 months. I suspect, being an international lawyer, that precedent here is important, and I would expect that maybe by the end of this year, if not sooner, we would see a similar resumption of power away from the military and back to a civilian government.
Thank you for those insights as well. Now, we only have a few more minutes to talk about. We've got to go to Nigeria. We have to go to Turkey as well. But we do want to talk about the latest developments in Turkey, which has also been a country of unrest in recent weeks. As we talked about last week, 301 miners were killed in a horrific accident. Now, if you didn't catch the show last week, we had a mining expert on, C.J. Abraham, and he told us inspectors should have more integrity, and if this happened in the U.S., they would have gone to jail. Your thoughts on that? Don, very quickly.
Well, I certainly agree with what he said. If you study what happened and hear the reports, you really have to wonder what chance those miners really had.
Yeah, I would agree with the notes from last week's speaker. There are mining accidents and there are mining accidents, and this is one of absolute colossal scale, and it again shows that that there are some weaknesses in Turkey's political institutions and keeping a sense of transparency and safety and security for its very, very important mining sector.
Absolutely. Let's also turn to Nigeria. 1 month ago, many here in the U.S. had never heard of Boko Haram, the militant group that kidnapped hundreds of young girls. Today, the UN Security Council has approved sanctions against Boko Haram, and there are concerns that they may be planning an attack here in the U.S. Tom Squitieri in D.C., any thoughts on this?
I would be interested to see what kind of attack Boko Haram would try to do in the United States.
I agree with that.
Yes.
They could. It just seems unreasonable and irrational to imagine this group in Nigeria planning something in the United States. Of course, people were surprised by September 11th, so there's nothing ever to be overruled. The fact that they're issuing these threats does suggest to me that, in part, they are nervous about now the attention that the world is focusing on them. We haven't backed them into a corner by any means yet. The girls are still out there. They have not been rescued, and nothing seems to be able to be done to corral their activities in Nigeria. They are reacting to the pressure a little bit, and in that sense, it means the world's focus may be starting to go down the right path.
And Tom, I love to have you as a guest here on Fresh Outlook. But we did talk about international journalists, and I want to just point out that I think there's more international journalists covering the wedding of Kim Kardashian and Kanye West. We wish they could be all over the world, but it shows sometimes where people's priorities are.